Apex. The treaty was 3 years old and still fragile enough that everyone on Earth's side of it had learned to hold their breath around the fine print. The galactic confederated worlds had opened exactly one door to humanity: provisional member status, pending demonstration of value, and every species already inside that door had an opinion about whether Earth deserved to walk through it. Lieutenant Ava Marks had not expected to be the one testing that door personally. She'd spent 6 years in the Corps before the first contact accords ever got signed, most of it in places that didn't show up on recruiting posters, and none of that experience had prepared her for the particular vertigo of being told by a man in an assembly dress uniform who couldn't quite meet her eyes that she'd been selected as the first human cadet in Confederated military history. The Premier Officer Academy, he'd said in the briefing 3 weeks earlier, back when the orders still had that word in them. Confederated Command Institute. You'll be representing all of Earth, Lieutenant. Try not to disappoint the entire species. He'd meant it as a joke. It hadn't landed as one. The transport that actually took her, when it finally left Earth orbit, was not bound for the Confederated Command Institute. Ava didn't learn this until 4 days into the crossing, when the ship's navigation display finally resolved a destination that matched nothing in her briefing packet. A designation logged only as Kharon Station, orbiting a world the Confederacy's own charts marked, without further embellishment, as hostile environment, unrestricted training use. There's been a change, the transport's Confederated liaison told her, with the particular blandness of someone reciting a lie he'd been handed rather than one he'd built himself. Administrative reallocation. Your new posting is the Special Warfare Center, Kharon's Anvil. That's not the academy I was briefed for. Dawn, the liaison agreed, and had the decency to look uncomfortable about it. It's a different institution entirely. She learned the rest of it much later, in pieces, the way you learn most of the truths that were built specifically to keep you from learning them at all. A coalition inside the Confederated Senate, 3 species with long memories of what happened to worlds the Confederacy judged militarily unworthy and therefore politically expendable, had spent the treaty's first year quietly arguing that Earth's provisional membership was a mistake waiting to be corrected. Humanity, their reasoning went, had no fleet worth measuring, no augmentation programs, no centuries of interstellar combat doctrine. A species that primitive contributed nothing to the Confederacy's defense and diluted everything it stood for. They couldn't block the treaty outright. The optics of humanity's first cadet succeeding at the Confederated Command Institute, a graduation ceremony, a photograph, a symbol, were exactly what the treaty's supporters needed to cement Earth's place permanently. So a Senate Marshal named Corvana Desic, whose homeworld had been one of the first the old Confederacy had written off as militarily negligible 3 centuries before it was quietly annexed, made a different calculation. Send her to the Anvil instead. Let the galaxy's most brutal training ground do what the Senate floor couldn't do politically. A 10% graduation rate did the coalition's work far more cleanly than any vote, and if the first human cadet in Confederated history died screaming in the mud of a training world nobody back on Earth had ever heard of, that told its own story too. Weak species did not survive the Anvil. That would be the entire argument, self-evident and unanswerable, written in a body bag instead of a debate. Nobody on the transport told Ava any of this. She worked most of it out herself, staring at the reassignment orders during the last night of the crossing, reading between lines that had clearly been written by someone who expected no one to ever need to read between them. She thought about turning around. The thought lasted exactly as long as it took her to remember every version of herself that had ever been told by someone who outranked her, that she didn't belong somewhere and should quietly disappear instead of proving them wrong. She didn't turn around. Kharon's Anvil from orbit looked like a world that had given up trying to be hospitable sometime in its distant geological past and never looked back. Mountain ranges serrated with volcanic scarring, jungle canopy so dense the survey scans couldn't confirm what moved beneath it, an atmosphere technically breathable and practically punishing, thin enough at altitude to make every step cost more than it should, thick with airborne spores at lower elevations that did unpredictable things to unprepared lungs. The Special Warfare Center didn't have a welcome ceremony. It had a landing strip, a scarred concrete yard, and a commandant named Vask Thorn, who looked at the 17 new cadets assembled in front of him. 6 species represented, Ava the only human among them, with an expression that suggested he'd already mentally filed most of them under casualty expected. 10% of you will graduate, Thorn said, without preamble, in a voice that carried the specific flatness of a man who'd said this exact sentence to exact rows of frightened cadets more times than he'd bothered counting. The other 90% will wash out, transfer out, or die. The Anvil does not distinguish between those outcomes, and doesn't particularly care which one you choose. You are here because your governments believe you might become something worth calling an operator. Most of you are wrong about that. We're going to find out which of you aren't." His gaze moved down the line and stopped, for exactly 1 extra second, on Ava. "Marks," he said, reading her name off a manifest without looking at it again. "Human." A pause that had weight in it, though his voice never changed pitch. "I was told to expect you eventually. I wasn't told it would be this soon or this unaccompanied." He didn't ask what she thought about her reassignment. He didn't need to. "The Anvil doesn't do favors, Lieutenant, and it doesn't do exceptions. Whatever got you rerouted here instead of the Institute, that's someone else's politics. Out here, you're just another body the jungle hasn't decided to kill yet." A ripple of something, not quite laughter, too controlled for that, moved through the cadets around her. A reptilian cadet near the end of the row, easily 2 heads taller than Ava, with plating along his forearms that looked less like armor and more like it had grown there on purpose, didn't bother hiding his contempt at all. "They sent a primitive," he said, to no one in particular, loud enough to be heard by everyone. "This should be short." Thorne didn't correct him. Thorne, Ava understood immediately, wasn't going to protect anyone from anything here. That wasn't what the Anvil was for. "First trial begins in 6 hours, Thorne said. "Get whatever equipment you're issued and get into the tree line before dark. If you're not back inside the perimeter within 72 hours, we assume the jungle made its decision about you and we stop looking." She should have died in the first 20 minutes. The equipment issued to first trial cadets was intentionally minimal. A blade, a water reclaimer, a beacon that wouldn't activate for 48 hours by design, because the trial wasn't about being found. It was about proving you could survive without being found. Ava had barely cleared the tree line, still calibrating to a gravity 8% heavier than Earth's, and an atmosphere that made her lungs work overtime for oxygen they weren't quite getting when the ground beneath her simply wasn't there anymore. The pit wasn't natural. She understood that even as she fell, some cold, analytical part of her brain still running triage while the rest of her scrambled for a handhold in the dark. The edges too clean, the collapse too precisely centered on the trail she'd been directed toward by a terrain map issued specifically to her at check-in, a map she'd later confirm no other cadet had received in the same version. She hit the bottom, hard enough to lose the air in her lungs, and hard enough she'd realize afterward that a body built with slightly less padding around the ribs wouldn't have gotten back up at all. 12 feet down, in a chamber that smelled like something had been using it as a den far more recently than she wanted to think about. The something announced itself with a sound she felt in her sternum before she heard it. Low, layered, the specific resonance of a chest cavity built for volume rather than speech. A scarn, she'd learned to call it later, though in that moment it had no name at all, just teeth and mass, and an intelligence in its eyes that made clear this wasn't blind animal aggression. It was patient. It had time. She was already in the hole. Ava did not have a plan that involved fighting it directly. She had instead 30 seconds of falling to notice the loose stone shelf along the pit's northern wall, a crack running up through it that looked recent, and a scarn moving toward her with the unhurried confidence of a predator that had never once needed to hurry in this particular hole. She threw her blade, not at the creature, which would have done nothing but announce she had one, but into the crack in the stone shelf, wedging it deep enough to hold her weight for exactly as long as she needed it to. She was 3 feet up the wall, fingers screaming, boots finding purchase on stone that hadn't been designed to be climbed, when the scarn's jaws closed on empty air where her leg had been a half-second earlier. She didn't make it to the top clean. It caught her boot on the second lunge, and the only reason she came free at all was that the boot came free first, sacrificed to a set of teeth that could have taken the foot inside it just as easily on a slightly better night for the scarn. She hauled herself over the pit's edge with one bare foot bleeding from stone scraping, and adrenaline doing the rest of the work her body didn't have left to give. She lay in the dirt at the top of the pit for a long time afterward, breathing air that still felt too thin, and understood 2 things with total clarity. The first was that someone had wanted her in that hole specifically. The second was that whoever had built that terrain map had badly underestimated exactly what kind of animal they were dealing with. She didn't report the map. That was the first real decision she made on Kharon's Anvil, and in retrospect it was the one that mattered most. Reporting it meant explaining that she suspected sabotage on day 1, which meant either being believed, in which case she'd be marked as the cadet who couldn't survive without special protection, exactly the story Marshal Corvain's coalition wanted told, or not being believed, in which case nothing changed except that everyone now knew she'd tried to complain her way out of a trial the rest of them had to face straight. Neither outcome helped her. She kept the map. She kept the boot, ruined as it was, wrapped and carried because evidence that meant nothing today might mean something later, and a soldier who'd spent 6 years learning to survive without support structures didn't throw away leverage on instinct. Instead, she adapted. Barefoot on one side for the better part of 2 days, she stopped moving in straight lines the way the map suggested and started reading the terrain the way she'd been trained to read terrain no algorithm had ever mapped for her. Game trails that predators used because prey used them first. Water sources that told her where the biggest things on this planet chose to drink and therefore where not to be at dusk. A skarn's rough calling pattern that she catalogued by ear until she understood roughly how far its territory extended and how to stay just outside the edge of it. On the second night, she found another cadet, the reptilian one, Draxos Ven, the one who'd promised the group this would be short, pinned under a fallen deadfall with a leg bent in a direction legs weren't meant to bend, 3 hours from bleeding out in a way his own species' physiology apparently didn't have a good answer for. She could have kept walking. Every ounce of what Draxos had said about her on the landing strip argued for keeping walking. She didn't. It took 40 minutes to lever the deadfall enough to free him, using a technique with a fulcrum and a length of vine that had nothing to do with any Confederated survival doctrine, and everything to do with a construction site in Ohio where Ava had spent a summer at 19, learning how a determined person moved weight that outclassed them by a factor of 10. Draxos didn't thank her. He looked at her, wary and unreadable, the way a predator looks at something it can't yet categorize as either threat or ally, and said nothing at all as she splinted the leg with materials that shouldn't have worked as well as they did. Why? He finally asked much later, once the shock had worn off enough for words. It was the same question she'd think much later that a dying trader had once asked a stranger in a story she'd never hear, on a planet 40 light years from either of them. Because you'd have died otherwise, Ava said. And because I figure the Anvil's going to kill enough of us on its own. I don't need to help it along. He didn't say anything else that night, but 3 days later, back inside the perimeter with 71 hours left on the trial's clock and both of them still breathing, he was the one who told the rest of the surviving cadets, unprompted, exactly how he'd ended up alive. The story moved through the cohort faster than Ava expected, and it didn't move the way she expected either. Some of the surviving cadets treated it as confirmation of exactly the naive weakness they'd assumed of her species. A soldier who wasted resources on a rival instead of using his injury to thin the competition. A hive-minded cadet named Nix, whose species processed the concept of individual mercy as something closer to a design flaw than a virtue, found the whole story genuinely difficult to pass. But Commandant Thorne, reviewing trial telemetry that evening in a debrief room that smelled like recycled air and old coffee substitute, found something else in the data, a collapse pattern in the pit trial that didn't match any natural terrain failure on record, a boot recovered and preserved instead of discarded, a rescue that cost a struggling cadet 40 minutes and a full night's rest, she badly needed, given freely to a cadet who'd publicly wished her dead 6 hours earlier. That's not survival instinct, his second, a clipped and severe officer named Master Sergeant Oyara said, studying the same footage. That's strategy. She's building something. Or she's soft, Thorne said, though even as he said it, something in his voice suggested he didn't fully believe it. Sentiment gets operators killed out here. Sentiment that saves a witness who now owes her a debt in a cohort that's actively trying to kill her. Oyara raised a brow ridge that, on her species, communicated something close to dry amusement. I'm not sure that's sentiment, sir. I think that's the first cadet in 6 years who understood the assignment better than we did. Thorne didn't answer that, but he flagged Lieutenant Marks's file for closer observation. And for the first time since the coalition had quietly rerouted her transport, someone at Kharon's Anvil started actually watching what she did, instead of simply waiting for her to stop doing it. The sabotage didn't stop. If anything, Draxos's shifting loyalty made it worse, because it proved to the cadets still hoping to see her fail that subtler methods were needed. Ava's equipment went missing twice more over the following months, always in ways that could be explained as jungle scavengers if anyone bothered asking. Her assigned bunk was flooded during a routine drainage exercise that flooded no one else's. During a joint exfiltration drill in the planet's northern highlands, her extraction beacon failed at the exact coordinate where a Vorhal, Kharon's Anvil's apex predator, a creature the size of a ground car with a killing method that made Skarn packs look almost gentle by comparison, had been tracked hunting 3 days prior. She survived that one by doing something that made it into training doctrine within the year, though it would be a long time before anyone admitted where the doctrine had actually come from. She didn't run. Vorhal tracked by movement and heat signature across long distances with brutal efficiency, and outrunning one across open highland terrain was a fight no cadet had ever won. Instead, she went still, buried herself in cold mud along a stream bed to mask her heat signature, and waited 11 hours, through a night that dropped near freezing, through a moment when the Vorhal passed close enough that she could count the individual scars along its flank, for the extraction window to reopen on its own. 11 hours was a long time to lie still with nothing to do but think, and Ava's mind, denied any other occupation, went where it always went when there was nothing left to perform for anyone. Home, not the Corps, not the 6 years of deployments that had taught her how to read terrain and read people. Further back than that, a kitchen in Ohio, a mother who'd worked 2 jobs to keep the heat running through the winter, who'd told her, the morning she shipped out for basic training, that the Marks family had never once had the luxury of being the strongest people in any room they'd ever walked into, and had survived every generation anyway by being the ones who refused to leave it. She thought about that, buried in mud, on a planet her mother would never find on a star chart, and understood, with a clarity the cold couldn't touch, exactly who she was doing this for. Not the Confederacy, not even Earth, in the abstract flag-waving sense the Assembly liaison had tried to hand her before any of this started. She was doing it for every person who'd ever been told by someone who outranked them that they didn't belong in the room and had gotten up anyway. Nobody engineered that failure had expected her to survive it through patience. Every cadet who'd tried it before her had tried to run. By her 2nd year on the Anvil, the sabotage attempts had a name among the instructors, spoken carefully and never in front of the cadets themselves. The Marks anomaly. Not because the attempts against her were unusual. Cadets had been killing each other under cover of trial conditions for as long as the Anvil had existed, and the instructors had long since stopped pretending otherwise. But because she kept turning every single one of them into evidence of exactly the trait the Coalition back on Earth had insisted humanity didn't possess. Adaptability under conditions nothing in her biology or her training had specifically prepared her for. The confrontation with Draxos, the one that mattered, the one that decided, in the cohort's private accounting, whether Ava Marks belonged among them or not, came during the 3rd-year war games, in a scenario designed to force cadets into direct competition for the same extraction slot with no possibility of alliance. He came at her clean, no more sabotage, no more engineered pits, a straight physical challenge in the scenario's final phase, testing which of them would take the single available slot and which would be marked eliminated. He had 40 pounds on her, denser bone structure, claws that could open the sealed extraction case faster than her hands ever would. She didn't fight him on his terms. She'd spent 2 years learning exactly what his terms were, the same patient study she'd once applied to Skarn, calling patterns, and Vorhal heat masking. And when the moment came, she used the one advantage no other species on Kharon's Anvil had ever needed to develop the way humans had. She read him entirely as a person rather than a threat profile. She knew, because she'd watched him for 2 years, that Draxos fought with his weight forward and his pride further forward still, that he'd taken her early mercy as a debt he still hadn't found a way to repay, and that the surest way to win this exchange wasn't strength against strength, but making him choose in front of the entire cohort whether that debt still meant something. "You already know how this ends if you come at me straight," she told him, blade drawn, but never raised, standing her ground instead of circling. "You're stronger, you'll probably win, and every cadet watching will know exactly how you won it, against the human who spent a night pulling a deadfall off your leg instead of walking past you." She let that sit. "Take the slot if you want it, but you're going to have to decide what kind of operator you want your record to say you are." He didn't attack. The pause stretched long enough that the observing instructors would talk about it for years afterward. A physical confrontation that ended not in violence but in a reptilian cadet lowering his claws, stepping back and saying low enough that only she and the recording drones caught it, "The slot is yours, Marks. Call it paid." Thorne, watching the footage that night with Oyara at his side, said nothing for a long time. "She didn't win that with strength," Oyara finally said. "No," Thorne agreed. "She won it with the same thing she's been winning everything with since the pit trial. She understands people better than anyone we've trained in a decade. Doesn't matter what species you put in front of her. She reads the room, and she reads it faster than we finish setting it up." Not every cadet who watched her survive learned to respect it the way Draxos eventually did. The hive cluster designated Nix 7, 6 linked bodies operating as extensions of a single distributed intelligence, more accustomed to solving problems through redundancy than through the kind of stubborn individual improvisation Ava specialized in, had spent 2 years treating her survival less as an achievement than as a statistical anomaly still awaiting correction. Hive collectives didn't hate. Hatred required an investment in outcome the collective considered inefficient. What Nix 7 had instead was something colder and, in its way, more dangerous. A running calculation, updated after every trial, of whether Ava Marks's continued presence in the cohort represented a net risk to the collective's own survival odds, and a complete willingness to act on that calculation the moment it tipped far enough in one direction. It tipped during the 3rd-year joint logistics trial, when 6 cadets were required to share a single extraction manifest, and Nix 7's distributed intelligence determined correctly that Ava's continued participation reduced the collective's own margin margin for error by a measurable percentage. The correction wasn't violent. It didn't need to be. NIX-7 simply routed her share of the trial's shared oxygen reserve through a fault engineered to look like standard wear and calculated with total confidence that she would either notice in time to fix it herself or she wouldn't, and either outcome would resolve cleanly into data. She noticed. She fixed it with 11 minutes of margin, using a bypass patch improvised from a ration wrapper and enough electrical tape to make Master Sergeant Oyara, reviewing the footage afterward, laugh out loud for the first time anyone on the instructional staff could remember. NIX-7's collective voice, when Thorne confronted the cluster about the failure, offered no denial and no apology, because both concepts required a moral framework the collective didn't operate from. The calculation has been updated, was all 6 linked bodies said in the same flat unison. Marks represents a lower risk than initially modeled, recalculating going forward. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't even respect yet, not in any sense a human or a Threll or a reptilian cadet like Draxos would have recognized as respect. But it was data, and data, to a hive intelligence, was the only apology that had ever mattered. By the 4th year, the instructors had stopped debating whether Ava Marks would graduate and started debating something else entirely. Where exactly in the Anvil's long and mostly grim history she ranked. Master Sergeant Oyara found her the night before the Reckoning's drop assignments were posted, in the equipment bay where Ava had taken to running maintenance checks long after the other 4th years had gone to sleep. Oyara didn't offer advice. Exactly. The Anvil's instructors weren't permitted to, and Oyara had never once in 4 years cut a cadet a procedural corner. What she offered instead was quieter than advice, and rarer. "I went through my own service's version of this place 40 years ago. Oyara said, watching Ava work rather than looking at her directly, which Ava had learned by then was as close as her species came to offering someone privacy inside a conversation. "Different planet, same design philosophy, near enough. I was the only one of my birth cohort who came home." She let that sit for a moment. "Nobody tells you, going in, that surviving it doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like still being here. I've watched you for 4 years, waiting to see if that would break you the way it broke people smarter than you and stronger than you both. It hasn't. I don't fully understand why not. Because it was never a fight I could win by being smarter or stronger," Ava said, not looking up from the beacon housing in her hands. "It was only ever a fight I could win by refusing to stop." Oyara was quiet for a long moment. "That," she finally said, "is the only correct answer anyone has ever given me in this bay. Good luck tomorrow, Lieutenant." It wasn't encouragement, not in any form Confederated regulation would have recognized as such. But it was the first time in 4 years anyone at Kharon's Anvil had wished her luck instead of simply waiting to see if she'd need it. The final trial, the one that separated the last handful of surviving 4th years from the title of operator, was called The Reckoning, and it had exactly one rule: survive 72 hours alone in the deep highlands, armed only with what you carried in, with no extraction guaranteed and no rescue coming regardless of what found you first. Cadets died during the Reckoning more often than they didn't. It was, by design, the closest the Anvil came to admitting outright what it actually was. Marshal Corvanet's coalition made one final attempt during the drop assignments. It came in the end not through some anonymous logistics officer, but through NIX-7's collective, the same distributed intelligence that had spent 3 years recalculating Ava's risk profile after every trial, and that now handled a significant share of the Anvil's drop coordinate processing as one of its assigned cohort duties. A coalition intermediary offered the collective's homeworld something it had wanted for 2 generations: relief from a resource dispute that had nothing to do with Kharon's Anvil, and everything to do with the same old Confederated calculus that had once written off worlds like Corvan's own as militarily negligible. In exchange, the collective needed only to route one cadet's final drop coordinates 6 kilometers north of the approved zone, into contested Vorhal territory during the one stretch of the season the Anvil's own protocols existed specifically to avoid. NIX-7 ran the calculation. 3 years of data on Ava Marks weighed against it more heavily than the collective had expected going in, and the 6 linked bodies made the alteration anyway, because a collective's calculus answered to its own survival first and always. But recalculation didn't stop simply because a decision had been made. In the 11 hours between the alteration and the drop, NIX-7 ran the numbers again, and did not like what 4 years of watching Ava Marks refuse to die had done to its confidence that this particular outcome would resolve as cleanly as the intermediary had promised. So the collective did the only thing its own logic would permit, without directly reversing a bargain already struck. It left the alteration exactly where it was, and routed a single anomalous flag through a secondary maintenance channel, addressed to no one in particular, easy to miss, and easier still to find if someone happened to be looking. Thorne happened to be looking. He stood in the operations center, with the corrected coordinates in one hand and the falsified ones in the other, and made the decision that would define the rest of his career at Kharon's Anvil. He didn't correct it. "Commandant," Oyara's voice, when she found the same discrepancy independently 20 minutes later, carried a warning edge. "If she dies on a coordinate someone falsified, that's not a training death. That's murder, and it's going to be traced straight back to this facility." "I know exactly what it is," Thorne said. "I've spent 4 years watching that woman turn every attempt to kill her into proof she should be here instead. I'm not going to insult her by deciding on her behalf that this is the one she can't survive." He looked at Oyara, and something in his expression had shifted entirely from the man who'd called her a primitive on a landing strip 4 years earlier. "But I'll be at the extraction point myself. If she needs pulling, I'm the one pulling her." She knew within an hour of the drop exactly where she'd been placed. The territorial markings were unmistakable to anyone who'd spent a night buried in cold mud 18 months earlier, learning of Vorhal's patrol patterns instead of running from them. She understood with the same cold clarity she'd felt falling into a pit on her first day on this world that someone had made one last attempt to finish what a Senate marshal had started 4 years ago and 40 light years away. She didn't waste time being afraid of that. Fear was a luxury the Anvil had trained out of her a long time ago, replaced with something more useful: attention. The Vorhal that found her on the second night was larger than the one she'd hidden from as a first-year, territorial and aggressive, in a way mating season made unavoidable, and it did not give her 11 hours to wait it out from a streambed. It found her at close range, in terrain with no cover worth the name, and for the first time in 4 years on Kharon's Anvil, Ava Marks understood that patience alone wasn't going to be the thing that saved her, so she used everything else instead. 4 years of catalogued Vorhal behavior, translated into a plan built in the 90 seconds she had to build one. A controlled brush fire, set with her last incendiary charge along the creature's most likely charge lane. Not to kill it, nothing she carried could have killed it, but to blind its heat-sensing organs at the exact moment it committed to a charge. A fall, calculated rather than desperate, down a scree slope, too steep for something its mass to follow cleanly. A held breath, submerged in a runoff pool at the slope's base, while 800 pounds of apex predator lost her signature in smoke and confusion, and eventually, reluctantly, gave up a hunt it had never expected to lose. She lay in that pool long after the danger passed, shaking with cold and adrenaline both, and found herself laughing, quiet, disbelieving, the particular laugh of someone who has just discovered, for the second time in her life, that she was still alive when every reasonable calculation said she shouldn't be. She made it to the extraction point 14 hours before the trial's window closed. Thorne was there himself, exactly as he'd promised, and he didn't say anything for a long moment as she climbed, mud-caked and hollow-eyed and entirely, defiantly upright, into the transport. 4 years, he finally said. 4 years, Lieutenant, and I still don't fully understand how you do it. I don't outfight anything on this planet, sir, Ava said, wrapping a thermal blanket around shoulders that had finally stopped shaking. I never could. I just refused to let it pick the terms. Graduation on Kharon's Anvil was not, historically, a ceremony. It was a debrief, followed by a designation, followed by cadets scattering to postings across a Confederacy that mostly forgot the Anvil existed the moment it stopped needing something from it. This one was different, and everyone in the room knew it before Thorne said a word. 4 years ago, Thorne told the assembled instructors, the full faculty, which had not happened for a graduation review in longer than most of them could remember. 17 cadets came off that transport. 2 are graduating today. One of them is a species we've never trained before, on a world some of you were quietly betting wouldn't survive her first trial. He looked down at the file in front of him, the same file that had once carried Marshal Corvain's fingerprints in the reassignment orders nobody had ever fully explained to her, that now carried 4 years of trial data no falsified coordinate or engineered pit trap had managed to erase. I've trained operators for 31 years, Thorne said. I have never signed off on a cadet with a strategic assessment this high. Not the Zanari Warcast candidates, not the Threll blood sworn, nobody. He set the file down. Lieutenant Ava Marks isn't the most physically dominant cadet this facility has ever produced. She is, by every metric this faculty has ever used to measure an operator's actual worth, the most dangerous one. She reads terrain like a native. She reads people better than that. And in 4 years, this planet threw every single thing it has at her, including several things it shouldn't have had to, and she is standing in this room anyway. Oyara, beside him, added the sentence that would end up quoted in more Confederated military journals over the following year than either of them could have anticipated. The Anvil doesn't grade on species, she said. It never has. It grades on whether you survive it, and how. Lieutenant Marks didn't just survive Kharon's Anvil. She's the reason we're rewriting 3 separate training doctrines before the next cohort arrives. Nix 7's collective, the other name on that graduation manifest, 6 bodies standing in the kind of uniform silence only a hive intelligence could hold in a room this charged, offered no speech and no visible reaction when the designations were read, but it approached Ava afterward, all 6 bodies moving with the same unhurried synchronization, and delivered the closest thing to acknowledgement its logic had ever produced for anyone outside its own collective. 4 years of data, it said, in that same flat unison. Every model this collective built predicted your elimination. Every model was wrong. The collective offers no apology, as the concept remains functionally meaningless to us. We offer this instead. Recalibration complete. You are the most efficient variable this collective has ever measured. It paused, and for just a moment, something that might have been the hive mind's own version of hesitation moved behind 12 identical eyes. We are glad the correction did not succeed. It was, Ava understood, the nearest thing to, I'm sorry, and I'm glad you're alive, that 6 linked bodies with no framework for either sentiment were ever going to manage. She decided it counted anyway. Marshal Corvanet's coalition never publicly acknowledged what their gambit had cost them. They didn't have the luxury of staying quiet about it for long. The intermediary who'd approached Nix 7's collective left a transaction trail a hive intelligence's own meticulous record-keeping made trivially easy to trace once Thorne's formal inquiry started pulling threads, and within a season Corvan found himself testifying before the same Senate committee he'd once lobbied to keep Earth out of the Confederacy at all, explaining under oath why his office had authorized contact with a training cohort's logistics processing during an active trial cycle. He was censured, quietly stripped of his committee seat, and reassigned to an administrative post on a world with considerably less influence than the one he'd started with. A small, almost incidental irony that by the end of it, he was the one whose value to the Confederacy had been judged not worth the investment. Ava never sought him out. She had, by then, exactly the kind of patience the Anvil had spent 4 years teaching her, and some victories were worth more left alone to finish themselves without her help. The story moved through the Confederacy on its own momentum. The first human cadet, rerouted by hostile political maneuvering, to the galaxy's most lethal training ground, graduating not merely alive, but ranked by the instructors who'd spent 4 years trying to break her as the single most dangerous operator candidate the facility had produced in 3 decades. Every military academy in Confederated space that had spent a year quietly assuming humanity had nothing to offer. Their alliance spent the following 6 months trying to secure their own human liaison instead. The Confederated Command Institute, the academy Ava had been meant for in the first place, the one meant to produce a clean symbolic photograph instead of a legend nobody had planned for, sent a formal request for human cadet candidates within the month. It was not the only one. Ava herself didn't stay to enjoy the political fallout. She'd never much cared about proving a point to a Senate marshal who'd never once met her in person, and the satisfaction, when it came from somewhere much smaller and much more permanent. The look on Thorne's face reviewing 4 years of data he still didn't fully understand. The sound of Draxos calling a debt paid in front of the whole cohort. The particular silence of 11 hours in cold mud that had taught her more about patience than 6 years in the Corps ever had. What she carried off Kharon's Anvil, more than the designation or the reputation or the sudden, inconvenient fame of being humanity's first Confederated operator, was something closer to certainty. Every species in that cohort had come to the Anvil with a singular biological gift: claws, venom, a hive mind, generations of dedicated war-caste breeding. And the planet had ground most of them down anyway, because a single gift, however sharp, eventually met terrain it hadn't been built for. Humanity had never had a single gift like that. What it had, instead, buried deep enough in its evolutionary history that most humans never had reason to notice it themselves, was the oldest advantage there was: the capacity to adapt to absolutely anything, one improvised, stubborn solution at a time, for as long as it took. Kharon's Anvil had tried, for 4 years, and by every means available to it, to prove that advantage didn't exist. It had, instead, only proven how far it could be pushed before it stopped being underestimated at all.